We did our project on changes in policymakers and policymaking after the fall of the Soviet Union. For context, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In March of 1985, a longtime member of the Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev, took leadership of the Soviet Union and its stagnant economy. He believed the only way to improve the economy was to completely restructure the Soviet government. He introduced the policies of glasnost, or political openness, and perestroika, or economic restructuring. Glasnost gave more freedoms to the citizens, such as the ability to criticize the government and the opportunity for other political parties. Perestroika meant the government would loosen its control over the economy. Gorbachev believed this would lead to innovation and initiative by allowing citizens to own businesses and giving them the ability to strike. However, these policies did not produce the desired result before the old command economy collapsed. The policies ended up causing more harm than good and left the economy in a worsened state. Gorbachev also adopted a policy of non-intervention in hopes of bettering the Soviet Union's international relations. For instance, Gorbachev ended Soviet involvement in the arms race and decreased military presence in the Warsaw Pact nations. This further damaged relations with satellite states. Frustrated by the poor economy and because of decreased involvement due to the non-intervention policy, independence movements and peaceful protests shot up through Eastern Europe. One by one, the satellite states of the Soviet Union began to break apart. Further, the Soviet image was weakened by events such as the fall of the Berlin Wall. For example, here, see the Berlin Wall being torn down. And finally, on Christmas Day in 1991, Gorbachev announced his resignation and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The decline of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union, or the CPSU, was an institution that dominated public policy and policymakers for most of the 20th century in the Soviet Union. The CPSU was the ruling party in the Soviet Union that held a monopoly on power until the early 90s. It controlled all aspects of political, social, economic, and cultural life within the Soviet Union. Nearly every high government official was a member of the party, and it allowed the CPSU to make policy that would be enacted by the government. In 1990, Gorbachev's attempts to reform the government to fix the economy eroded much of the CPSU's monopolistic power, and soon after, the party voted to surrender its constitutionally guaranteed power, which allowed for other parties to participate in government and elections. However, the CPSU still maintained a lot of power and did not agree with Gorbachev's reforms. They used their remaining power to initiate a coup against Gorbachev, and after failing, the party was stripped of its powers and banned a few months before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This allowed public policy and policymakers to be changed in a way that multiple parties could have power in the government. In the 1995 election, there were over 8,000 candidates from 43 different parties, and the first president, Boris Yeltsin, disassociated himself with the CPSU and acted as an independent for the remainder of his political career. The main takeaway here is that public policy and policymakers differed in the fact that they were not controlled by the Communist Party. But in recent times, there's been a similar situation to the CPSU because the United Russia Party has dominated the Russian government since the early 2000s, led by Vladimir Putin. United Russia holds a majority of positions in the government, and Putin is able to exercise his power for the most part unchecked. As shown in the graphic, United Russia dominated the recent elections of the Federal Duma and controls much of the government like the CPSU. For a bit more context, one of the main factors and causes of change in public policy and policymakers after the dissolution of the Soviet Union is this constitutional conflict. Looking back at the attempted coup against Gorbachev, the main takeaway is not that the coup failed and Gorbachev remained president. The main takeaway is that Boris Yeltsin rallied the Soviet people against the coup and therefore grew significantly in popularity. The scene here is Boris Yeltsin giving his famous speech upon atop of a tank, rallying the Soviet people against the coup and condemning it. And this caused his popularity to grow significantly, while Gorbachev's popularity decreased. This allowed him to gain the support to be elected the first president after the dissolution. However, Russia was still following its Soviet-era constitution, and that constitution did not specify whether the executive branch or the legislative branch held supreme power. Many economic conflicts between Yeltsin and the parliamentary leadership led to these conflicts being seen as constitutional conflicts. In 2003, in response to the parliament stripping him of his decree-making powers given after the coup in 2001, Yeltsin announced a referendum to see who really ruled in Russia. Yeltsin won a majority of votes, but he did not win enough votes to get a majority of the population. Therefore, Yeltsin was still president and the parliament was not dissolved, and the uneasy relationship remained untouched. In 1993, Yeltsin established a constitutional convention to write a new constitution. However, the parliament had also made its own constitutional convention. In response, Yeltsin dissolved the parliament, which the parliament there declared an illegal action, impeached him, and swore in his vice president. To protect his authority, troops loyal to Yeltsin marched in the parliamentary building, and after a brief skirmish, the troops captured the parliament. Seen here, the tanks even fired upon the parliamentary building, and this left Yeltsin with a clear path for a new parliament and constitution. Changes in the executive leader. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we see a large change in policymakers in terms of the most powerful member of government. In the Soviet Union, the General Secretary was the leader of the country. Joseph Stalin was the first to make this position the most powerful in the state. The General Secretary was the chairman of the Politburo and was chosen by other members of the Politburo and was confirmed by the Central Committee. The General Secretary's power consisted of deciding the Politburo's agenda and schedule, acting as chief executive of the Communist Party, supervising the nomenklatura, chairing the Defense Council, and representing the Soviet Union in international affairs. Now, looking back towards the parliament's attempted impeachment of Yeltsin, Yeltsin had complete control over what this new constitution would say, and after experiencing conflict with the parliament, Yeltsin was inclined to enhance his own power and secure his authority. Instead of a general secretary, the leader was now a president, and this new constitution after the dissolution gave the president the power to appoint the prime minister, to issue decrees with the force of law if they did not contradict federal or constitutional law, to dismiss the Duma, or the new legislative branch, and to call for new parliamentary elections. This president differs from the general secretary in many ways. For starters, the president is not elected by the Communist Party or even the ruling party, but they are elected by the people. The president has a much tighter grip on the legislative branch. And finally, and overall, the president is much more powerful than a general secretary post-Stalin period, and has much less checks on his power as a result of the conflict with the legislative branch.
Pop quiz. First question. What policies did Gorbachev implement that quickened the fall of the Soviet Union? Give you about 5 seconds to write that down. It was glasnost and perestroika. And the second question was the highest position of power in the Soviet Union. The answer to that was, of course, the Secretary General. Alright, now on to legislative powers. Before the collapse, there was the Congress of the People's Deputies, which was the first vote by the USSR citizens. So they got to vote on who made it into the Congress of the People's Deputies. And then those that were voted into the Congress of People's Deputies voted on who was in the Supreme Soviet, which was the higher up legislative body. The Congress of the People's Deputies was, there was one in each republic, while there was only one Supreme Soviet for the entire country. And then after the collapse, there was the Duma, which was the new lower house, had much more power, many more people than the lower house, or the upper house, which was the Federation Council. The Federation Council only had 170 people in it, compared to the Duma's 450. The Duma had responsibilities about starting and accepting and rejecting legislation, while the Federation Council could only approve or reject legislation about taxation. The Duma could overrule the Federation Council's veto or the President's veto with a 2/3 majority vote. And policies changed. Well, before the collapse of the USSR, Stalin's policies were oppressive to non-Russians. A lot of times in the workforce, Russians and Ukrainians were top of the workforce, and other nationalities were kind of lower in each republic. And then Khrushchev came along and reversed some of those repressive policies. And then after Khrushchev, Gorbachev came and tried to reform even further, and that ended up being a disaster, and it was part of what caused the USSR to crumble. And then after that, Yeltsin tried to use policies to fix the economy, and he was much more successful than previous USSR attempts. part of how we can tell is because Russia's government didn't disintegrate after the policies were in place, and all the progress that has came after the USSR was terminated.